He smelled good, kissed like a god, but for Peggy Lipton, that was it. The sentence appears in respected reviews of the actress's memoir and was turned into a headline by Sensationalism. What really happened between Peggy and Elvis? What is fact, what is interpretation, and what is legend? Today, we sort it all out, with sources. Peggy Lipton is not just any source. An actress emblematic of the counterculture in the Mod Squad and rediscovered decades later in Twin Peaks, she published her memoir, Breathing Out, in 2005. In respected editorial outlets, the summary of her affair with Elvis became crystallized. For Peggy, he was a great kisser, and that was it. This is the safe, verifiable starting point of the account, adopted by prestigious publications. A high-credibility newspaper obituary reinforces the same formulation and helps situate the anecdote within Elvis's public persona at that time, including a behind-the-scenes note that humanizes and demystifies the icon. The mention of Elvis who wore a girdle, a detail of vanity and image control. This shifts the conversation from a simplistic label to a period portrait, a superstar who choreographed even his own body before the world. When did the affair happen? Reliable references point to the early 1970s, with a trip to Lake Tahoe by private plane, a setting very consistent with Elvis's life in that phase. Pinning down the chronology is essential. It anchors the story in time and place, avoids undated rumors, reduces the temptation to psychologize Elvis out of context, and prevents Peggy's memory from being treated as a timeless piece of gossip. This is where the major popular confusion is born. The sentence, "With me, he was virtually impotent," has circulated in the entertainment press for years, but almost always as a paraphrase of the same factual core. Great kisser, and that was it, without a specific page from the book. In other words, it amounts to a media frame applied to the episode narrated by Peggy. For responsible treatment, it is crucial to separate what she actually recorded in a restrained and factual tone from the inflamed reading that tabloids and aggregators repeat. Why does this distinction matter? Because impotence is a clinical and generalizing term, whereas "it didn't happen" is a specific report confined to a particular relationship on a specific night in a specific phase. Peggy reports sexual frustration. The press has at times translated this as a permanent diagnosis, a logical leap that the original text and serious reviews do not make. In telling the story, it's worth underscoring this nuance. First, the verifiable fact, then the interpretation that went viral. Another piece of context is Peggy's own trajectory. Her memoir mentions marriage to one of the most influential producers in music and high-profile relationships. This background is not name-dropping. It indicates that she moved at the top of pop culture and had the social capital to tell stories without needing to inflate them to get attention. In terms of credibility, this supports her testimony as a memory examined by the serious press. There are also curiosities that help compose the encounter. The idea of an Elvis meticulous about his own image, including in his intimate wardrobe, and the cinematic frame of a jet ride to Lake Tahoe add texture without going beyond what the documentation allows. The final picture is clear: a vain Elvis, powerful in myth, but also human, with hesitations and limits offstage. A luxurious encounter that, with Peggy, stopped at kissing. In sum, what Peggy actually conveys, and what the best editorial summaries repeat, is that, with her, the intimate relationship did not progress beyond hissing. It was frustrating, and that was it. That is the factual core. The label "virtually impotent," spread by tabloids, is an editorial frame applied to the same episode, not a literal quotation grounded in the text. By maintaining this distinction, the narrative gains rigor and clarity. You deliver to the public the story that went viral, but make clear what is soberly documented and what is sensationalist amplification. When Peggy Lipton's story reached the broader public, many people wanted to turn a specific episode into a permanent diagnosis. The problem with this reading is that it ignores a robust set of accounts that point to another reality. With different women, in different phases, Elvis adopted his own limits and preferences, sometimes out of moral conviction, sometimes as an image strategy, sometimes due to exhaustion or simple momentary incompatibility. In other words, there was an intimate policy around the king, and it rarely fit into easy labels. One axis of this intimate policy was the idea of everything but. Before marriage, Elvis imposed on himself a rule that kept intimacy in a controlled territory: affection, kissing, caresses, but without advancing to penetration. It wasn't just religious modesty, it was also reputation calculus and scandal prevention at a time when out-of-wedlock pregnancy could destroy careers. This voluntary limit, practiced for years, helps explain why certain partners recall intense yet restrained encounters. What from the outside might look like coldness or dysfunction was, from the inside, a combination of beliefs, self-control, and careful image management. On the other hand, there are accounts of relationships involving passion and surrender, especially when Elvis felt safe enough to break the moral break he himself imposed. In some memoirs, he appears as an affectionate, warm lover, yet with particular quirks, preferences for rhythm, specific reluctances, a kind of intimate choreography in which he set the pace. This is not uncommon in figures who live under the spotlight. The need for control that sustained him on stage spilled over into private life. In love, as in music, Elvis liked to mark the tempo. There is also the physical dimension and the inhuman schedule. Over the years, the nocturnal routine, long show seasons, and the back and forth of tours created a body in forced march. This affected sleep, mood, and desire. In certain periods, especially in the 70s, the use of prescription medications entered as a crutch to sleep, to wake, to endure pain, and to keep the motor running. These cycles produce fluctuations, nights when the body responds and nights when it doesn't, moments of energy and moments of blockage. Reducing this complex picture to works or doesn't work loses nuances that make all the difference. Another layer is the power of myth over intimacy. Elvis carried the weight of being a universal sex symbol, and that mask often creates distance. For some partners, what they found in the bedroom was not the titan of the stage, but a shy, vain man, concerned with every detail of his own body and the setting around him. A man who could be extremely gentle and, at the same time, extremely ritualistic. This ritualization reduced spontaneity, but gave him a sense of security. When the internal script flowed, the experience was described as intense. When it jammed, the night ended short of what the myth promised. The accounts also reveal how differences in age and social power influenced the dynamics. With very young women, or those in a position of adoration, Elvis sometimes reinforced a guardian posture. He taught, guided, imposed limits. With experienced, confident women of equivalent status, the negotiation seemed more horizontal, still with his control at the center, but open to adjustments. This explains why memories can sound contradictory without necessarily being so. Each relationship had its own rules, boundaries, and emotional contract. Finally, there is the inner circle. Close friends and members of the entourage report that Elvis oscillated between phases of asceticism and phases of indulgence. In one, he could go weeks focused on music, spiritual reading, martial arts, and discipline. In another, he plunged into excess, food, medications, and long nights. His intimate life followed these peaks and valleys. In peaks of discipline, he kept a short leash. In valleys of exhaustion, the body asked for a pause or simply did not follow the script. It's human, even if amplified by the scale of the character. It becomes clear then that speaking of impotence as an essential trait is not supported by the set of versions. What exists is a mosaic of experiences. In one piece, the encounter doesn't go beyond kissing. In another, the night is remembered as ardent. In another, there is affection and tenderness but little appetite. In all of them, the common denominator is control. Control of image, of time, of the body, of what could or could not happen. This control helped Elvis be what he was in public. In private, it both protected and limited him. Elvis's intimate policy, therefore, combines three engines: a moral code that filtered how far to go, an instinct for reputation management that avoided risks, and a body subjected to pressures that varied performance. When these three engines turned in his favor, the devoted, affectionate, present lover emerged. When they turned against him, the experience fell short, sometimes by conscious choice, sometimes by bodily failure, sometimes by a mix of both. In the end, the conflicting versions do not cancel each other out. They explain one another. The same man who set arenas ablaze could, in the silence of a bedroom, prefer the safe ground of limits. The same star capable of breaking musical rules could, by conviction or strategy, maintain rigid rules in intimacy. And the same body that seemed infinite on stage was, like any body, subject to fatigue, anxiety, chemistry, and time. Understanding this does not diminish the myth. On the contrary, it returns to the myth the humanity without which no legend stands. To understand what may have happened in the encounter between Elvis and Peggy, and to close the story with rigor, it is necessary to swap easy certainties for responsible hypotheses. The first hypothesis is the moral code. Elvis carried a unique blend of domestic religion, romantic ideal, and reputation calculus. For him, the idea of keeping certain boundaries could sound like virtue, self-control, and even care, a way to protect his public image and, at the same time, the woman he was with. This moral yardstick was not an occasional mask. It was part of how he organized intimacy. Interpret the gesture of stopping at kisses not as incapacity, but as adherence to a rule that made sense at that moment and with that person. The second hypothesis is image control. Elvis lived with the awareness that any slip had the potential to become a scandal. Fame remodels the body. Every gesture becomes calculated. The control that kept him impeccable on stage, hair, wardrobe, choreography, lighting, invaded the backstage. In private, this could mean ritualizing intimacy, staging steps, limiting risks, avoiding situations that could escape the narrative he wanted to preserve. When intimacy meets this safety belt, desire submits to the script and sometimes stalls. The third hypothesis is physiological and circumstantial. Bodies under pressure vary. A nocturnal routine, domestic jet lag, irregular food, chronic pain, medications to sleep, to wake, to endure the pace, all of this affects libido, attention, energy, and sexual response. In this hypothesis, we are not talking about a permanent state, but about oscillations. Good nights and bad nights, weeks of vigor and weeks of exhaustion, phases in which the body keeps up with the myth, and phases in which it calls for help. Added to performance anxiety, the feeling that one must live up to the collective fantasy of the sex symbol, the body can simply say, "Not today." The fourth hypothesis is relational. Chemistry between two people is not a universal constant. Differences in age, social standing, expectations, and timing change the mood. With younger partners, Elvis sometimes acted as a tutor, imposing limits that seemed pedagogical. With more experienced women, negotiation could be more horizontal, though still crossed by his need to conduct the tempo. In quick encounters, common ground sometimes doesn't form. In longer stories, intimacy finds its own sound. In a careful reading, the episode with Peggy fits this affective math. Too high trajectory, too strong imaginaries, and, that night, little convergence. The fifth hypothesis is psychological without pathologizing. Living under the spotlight creates a mismatch between persona and person. The bigger the myth, the greater the chance that intimacy becomes a paradoxical place. It is where one seeks rest, but also where the myth demands coherence. If the mind is occupied with maintaining the character, spontaneity shrinks. Some celebrities respond with hypersexuality, others with ritual, withdrawal, or intermittence. The same impulse that guarantees artistic discipline can produce caution in the bedroom. There is no contradiction in this. There is a coherent way of functioning. These hypotheses do not compete with each other. They add up and, in different proportions, explain why accounts from partners sound varied. In some, a devoted, playful, present lover appears. In others, a gentle but restrained man with rigid preferences and clear limits. In others still, an encounter that simply doesn't take off. The mosaic is only contradictory if the expectation is of a one-dimensional character. Real life is polychromatic, and intimacy even more so. and how to close the narrative without sensationalism. First, conceptual clarity. Impotence is a clinical, generalizing label. Peggy's episode is a specific experience. Turning a specific case into a permanent diagnosis is a narrative shortcut that impoverishes the truth. Second, hierarchy of facts. What is anchored in solid accounts comes first. What is reinterpreted by the press comes later, with an interpretation label, not as proof. Third, historical context. The sexual morals of the time, fear of out-of-wedlock pregnancy, celebrity culture, and the gap between persona and person. Without this, any debate becomes anachronistic. Fourth, humanization. There is no need to sanctify or to reduce. Elvis may have been, at the same time, a planetary sex symbol and a man who, in certain circumstances, imposed brakes, obeyed codes, yielded to fatigue, or succumbed to anxiety. Accepting this ambivalence rescues the humanity that the myth-making machine tends to sand down. Fifth, verbal responsibility. Instead of "Elvis was X," prefer "There are reports that, with so-and-so, Y happened, with such-and-such, Z happened. Biographers raise hypotheses A, B, C." This simple adjustment of language takes the story out of the courtroom of verdicts and returns it to the field of inquiry. For the final tie-up, a three-step synthesis is worthwhile. Step 1. With Peggy, the encounter did not go beyond kissing. This is the hard datum, reiterated by respectable accounts. Step 2. The expression "virtually impotent" does not describe the essence of the man, but rather the way part of the press chose to package the fact. Step 3. When the moral, image control, physiological, relational, and psychological hypotheses are put on the table, the puzzle gains depth and loses the easy appeal of caricature. The result is more interesting than any headline. The story of an icon who, away from the spotlights, dealt with the same dilemmas that cross common people's intimacy: limits, expectations, insecurities, phases of the body, work pressures, differences in rhythm. The myth does not disappear, it changes scale. And it is precisely in this change of scale that the narrative completes itself, without scandal and without absolution, only with the respect that complexity demands. If this story helped you see the myth behind the man, do this. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next episodes. Leave a like because it shows YouTube that this content is worthwhile, and send it to a friend who loves music and good pop investigations. Comments open. What did you think of this version of the facts? I read everything. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you next time.